Welcome. Thank you for joining us here at the Z-Files. What follows is a slow, gentle journey into one of the quieter mysteries of the ancient world, a story of stone set among humid forests and unhurried rivers at the southern edge of what is now Central America's Costa Rica. There is no need to hold on to every word. Let the images come and go like breath. Simply rest and listen. Part 1. Silent Sentinels of the Diquís Delta. Imagine, for a moment, that you are standing at the edge of a wide, slow river in southern Costa Rica. The air is warm and thick with moisture, the kind of air that wraps around you like a second skin. Around you, the forest breathes. Tall trees lean over the water, their roots tangled and patient in the dark soil. Insects hum in distant layers of canopy, and somewhere above, a bird calls once and then goes quiet. The river, the Rio Teraba, moves in no particular hurry. It has been moving this way for a very long time, carving its path through the lowland plain known as the Diquís Delta, depositing silt and stone and the slow accumulation of centuries. And here, half buried in that same earth, resting among the roots and the red soil, are spheres. Perfect, or very nearly perfect, spheres of dark grey stone. They are not small. Some of them sit at about the height of your waist. Others rise taller than a person. The largest among them measure more than 2 meters across, which is something like 6.5 feet in diameter, and they weigh, in some cases, close to 15 tons. That is the weight of several large trucks stacked together, resting in a single, smooth, rounded object sitting quietly in the jungle floor. They do not look like anything was ever meant to be done with them. They look, instead, like they simply arrived. Like they have always been there. Like they belong to the land the way boulders belong to a riverbed, without explanation and without apology. The Diquís Delta itself is a flat, fertile region in the Osa Peninsula area of what is now the Chiriquí province of southwestern Costa Rica. The word Diquís comes from the Baruca language, and it refers broadly to this river delta and its surrounding wetlands. It is a lush place. The rains come heavily and often, and the vegetation responds with enthusiasm. In the wet season, which is long, the ground stays saturated and the rivers swell. In the drier months, the earth settles and the stones in the river flash in the light. It is a place that feels, in its bones, old. And the spheres feel old too. They carry the particular stillness of things that have waited a very long time. When Western researchers first formally described these objects in the 1930s, there was immediate confusion. Doris Stone, the daughter of a fruit company executive, encountered them in the context of land being cleared for banana cultivation. Workers from a United Fruit Company had been excavating fields across the delta for agricultural use, and in the process they had turned up dozens of these spheres, some of them still buried, some of them already sitting exposed on the surface. Stone recognized that they were remarkable and wrote about them, drawing the attention of the broader archaeological community. Soon after, a researcher named Samuel Lothrop arrived to document them more systematically. He measured, catalogued, and described them with care, though even he could only speculate about their origins and purposes. What Lothrop and others found was something genuinely unusual. These were not rough stones shaped vaguely into rounded forms. They were carefully, deliberately, almost obsessively spherical. The degree of precision involved was immediately apparent even to the naked eye. Later measurements using modern technology, including three-dimensional laser scanning, would confirm what early researchers suspected. Many of these spheres are accurate to within a very small margin, some within 0.5% of perfect geometric sphericity. That means that if you took a mathematically ideal sphere and placed it beside one of these ancient stones, the difference between them, measured across the entire surface, might be smaller than a few millimeters. In some cases, smaller still. Think about what that means for a moment. The people who made these spheres had no metal tools, as far as the archaeological record shows. They had no lathes, no calibrated measuring instruments in the modern sense, no computers to calculate geometric tolerances. They were working in stone, by hand, in a tropical rainforest, likely over long periods of time. The basalt they used, the dark volcanic rock from which the spheres were carved, is one of the harder stones available. It does not give way easily. Shaping it into a rough form is one kind of challenge. Shaping it into a sphere accurate to within millimeters across a diameter of 2 meters is something else entirely. The techniques that researchers believe were used involve a combination of what are called pecking, grinding, and abrasion. Pecking means striking the surface with a harder stone repeatedly, removing tiny fragments of material in a controlled way, slowly nudging the shape toward round. Grinding involves rubbing the surface against another stone, or against sand, to smooth out the high points and bring the surface into alignment. Abrasion with fine sand, possibly wet sand, would have refined the surface further, evening out microscopic ridges and filling in minute irregularities. It is painstaking work. It is the kind of work that requires not just skill, but patience of a particular, meditative kind. Some researchers have proposed that the spheres may have been roughed out first into approximate spheres and then rotated against a flat surface with an abrasive material, which would naturally cause the high points to wear down faster than the low points, pushing the form towards sphericity over time. This is a plausible and elegant idea, and it may account for some of the precision observed. But it does not fully explain the largest spheres, which are too heavy to rotate easily, or the remarkable consistency of the surface curvature across the full three-dimensional form, not just the equatorial plane. There are, at latest count, more than 300 of these spheres documented across the Diquís Delta and nearby regions, including several on Isla del Cono, a small island off the Pacific coast. They range in size from objects small enough to hold in 2 hands up to those massive multi-ton monuments. They are made almost entirely of gabbro, which is a coarse-grained igneous rock closely related to basalt, though some researchers use the term basalt loosely to include gabbro in this context. The nearest geological sources for this kind of rock are in the Talamanca mountain range, which lies to the north and east of the delta. That range is not close. It is separated from the delta by terrain that, even now, is not easy to traverse. Moving a 15-ton stone sphere from the mountains to the lowland plain, without wheeled vehicles, without draft animals native to the Americas, without cranes or engines, is a logistical problem that has not yet been fully solved in the scholarly literature. And yet the spheres are there, solid, cool, and patient, resting in the earth as if they have never been anywhere else. There is something about the smoothness of the stone that deserves a moment of quiet attention. If you were to place your hand against one of these spheres, which visitors to certain museums and parks are sometimes allowed to do, you would feel a surface that is unlike most stone. Basalt and gabbro are naturally somewhat smooth minerals, but weathered stone is usually rough, pitted, crusted with lichen, broken up by centuries of freeze and thaw. These spheres, even after perhaps 1500 years, still carry a smoothness that suggests enormous care. The surface is cool in a way that larger masses of stone tend to be, holding the temperature of the earth rather than the temperature of the air. It is a tactile experience that is hard to put into words, and perhaps does not need to be. Some things are simply felt. The silence around them, when the birds and insects are briefly still, is the silence of deep time. Of something that has outlasted everyone who made it, everyone who placed it, everyone who looked at it first. It is the silence of mystery without urgency, of a question that has been sitting in the earth for so long that it has grown comfortable there, and no longer requires an immediate answer. Let the thought of those smooth stones settle with you now as we move a little deeper into the story of who made them, and when, and something of why. Part 2. A people without a name in history. The spheres were made by people who left no written records. This is perhaps the most quietly startling fact about them. We have no inscriptions, no codices, no carved hieroglyphs, no stone tablets explaining their purpose. The civilization or cultures that produced these objects existed in a time and place where writing, in the form that has survived elsewhere in the ancient Americas, was not practiced, or at least has not yet been found. What we know about these people comes entirely from what they left behind in the earth. The spheres themselves, along with pottery, jade objects, gold ornaments, human remains, and the traces of their settlements and burial mounds. Archaeologists refer to the broader cultural tradition of this region under various terms, and the naming is somewhat complex. The Diquís Archaeological Zone, which was inscribed on the UNESCO World Heritage List in 2014, encompasses several pre-Columbian chiefdom settlements. The people of this region are sometimes grouped under the broad cultural label of the Aguas Buenas tradition in earlier periods and the Chiriquí tradition in later ones, though these labels are themselves contested and revised as new research emerges. What seems clear is that the sphere-making tradition was active roughly between the years 600 and 1500 of the Common Era, with the peak of production likely somewhere in the middle of that window, perhaps around 1000 to 1200. Some earlier dates have been proposed, but the consensus leans toward this general range. 600 to 1500 years ago is not so very long ago, in geological time. But in human terms, it spans a remarkable arc. Think of what was happening in other parts of the world during that window. In Europe, the medieval period was unfolding. Cathedrals were being built, plagues were sweeping cities, the printing press was still centuries away. In Asia, dynasties were rising and falling. In Mesoamerica, great cities like Teotihuacan had already declined, and new polities were taking shape. And here, in the wet lowlands of southern Costa Rica, skilled craftspeople were grinding stone into perfect spheres and placing them in the landscape with evident intention. The social structure of the sphere makers appears to have been organized around chiefdoms, which archaeologists define as societies with ranked social hierarchies but without the full institutional complexity of states. A chief, or perhaps a lineage of chiefs, would have commanded labor and resources sufficient to undertake major projects. Making a large stone sphere was certainly a major project. It required identifying and quarrying suitable stone, transporting it significant distances, probably organizing teams of workers, and then committing enormous hours to the shaping process. This is not something an individual does alone. It is something a community does, under direction, for a purpose that matters to the community. What purpose? This is where the evidence becomes quieter and the interpretation becomes more careful. The spheres have been found in several consistent contexts. Many of them were placed in front of important structures, likely the residences of chiefs or high-ranking individuals. The arrangement is not random. In some sites, spheres were positioned in lines or geometric clusters that suggest deliberate, meaningful placement. In other cases, they were found near burial mounds, associated with the remains of high-status individuals and accompanied by grave goods including gold ornaments, carved jade pieces, and elaborately painted ceramics. The association with elite spaces is fairly consistent across the documented sites. This has led many researchers to suggest that the spheres functioned as status markers, objects that communicated the power and prestige of whoever controlled them. A chief who could command the labor to produce and move a 15-ton sphere was, by that very fact, demonstrating the extent of their authority. The sphere was not just an object. It was a statement. It said, "I have the people, the resources, and the organizational capacity to do this," which, in a chiefdom society, is essentially the same as saying, "I am the chief, and you are in my territory." But there is more to the story than status display, or at least researchers suspect there is. The precision of the spheres goes beyond what mere prestige display would demand. A rough approximation of a sphere would make the same social statement as a perfect one, arguably. The investment of additional effort to achieve that near-perfect geometric accuracy suggests that accuracy itself mattered. Why would it matter? This is where the researchers' interpretations diverge somewhat, and where honesty requires the use of words like likely and possibly and disputed. One line of thinking connects the spheres to cosmological or astronomical knowledge. The people who made these spheres lived in a landscape shaped by cycles: the rainy season and the dry season, the flooding of rivers and their retreat, the planting and harvesting of crops. Like agricultural peoples everywhere, they would have been attentive to the movements of the sun, the stars, and the visible planets. Several of the sphere arrangements that have been documented show alignments that may correspond to astronomical features. Linear arrangements of spheres at some sites appear to point toward the positions of sunrise or sunset at the equinoxes, the 2 days each year when the sun rises due east and sets due west. Triangular groupings have been interpreted by some researchers as reflecting the positions of star clusters visible from this latitude. The word may in the previous paragraph is doing important work. Astronomical alignments in ancient sites are one of the more contested areas of archaeology, because with enough arrangements of points, it is possible to find alignments with astronomical features by chance. The human brain is very good at finding patterns, including patterns that are not actually there. So researchers in this area are cautious, and rightly so. What can be said is that some of the documented sphere arrangements are consistent with astronomical alignments, and that the hypothesis deserves continued investigation. It has not been proven, but it has not been dismissed either. What has been established more firmly is that the people who made the spheres had a sophisticated understanding of geometry, sufficient to produce objects of near-perfect sphericity in a demanding material without modern instruments. That level of geometric knowledge suggests a broader intellectual culture that was comfortable with abstract form and precise measurement. Whether that same culture applied geometric thinking to the movements of celestial bodies is an open question, but it is not an implausible one. There is also the matter of the basalt itself and what it meant to these people beyond its material properties. Stone, in many indigenous cultures of the Americas, was not simply a resource. It was understood to have a kind of presence, a quality of being that made it appropriate for sacred or important contexts. Basalt from volcanic mountains carries with it the memory of fire and deep earth. Shaped into a sphere, the most complete and self-contained of all geometric forms, it becomes something that resists easy categorization. Not a tool, not a weapon, not quite a container. A sphere simply is. It occupies space in a way that is simultaneously humble and absolute. Perhaps that quality was part of the point. Perhaps the people who placed these spheres in front of their chiefs' houses, or beside their burial mounds, were placing into the landscape something that communicated permanence and completeness. Something that said, in the language of form rather than words, this is a place of importance, and what is here will endure. Whether that interpretation is correct or not, the spheres have indeed endured. They have outlasted the chiefdoms that made them, the forests that were cleared for banana plantations, the hands of looters and collectors, and the indifference of many decades during which their significance was not widely understood. They are still here, cool and round and patient, waiting for whatever question we most need to ask them. We will carry those questions gently forward now, into the details of the stone itself and the long, mysterious journey it made from mountain to delta. Part 3. Stone born of fire, carried by human hands. The rock from which the spheres were made did not begin its life in the Diquís Delta. It began somewhere much older and much higher, in the volcanic uplands of the Talamanca mountain range that runs like a spine through southern Costa Rica and into western Panama. The Talamanca range is ancient by regional standards, built up through millions of years of tectonic activity as the Caribbean and Nazca plates pressed against each other and forced the land upward. The result is a rugged, cloud-covered highland of considerable elevation, its upper slopes cold and windswept, its lower flanks draped in dense forest. And threaded through its geology, in intrusive formations that cooled slowly deep within the crust, are deposits of gabbro and related igneous rock, dark, dense, and hard. Gabbro forms when magma cools slowly underground rather than erupting at the surface. This slow cooling allows mineral crystals to grow large enough to be visible to the eye, giving the rock a coarse, speckled texture when freshly broken. It is heavy, structurally consistent, and takes well to shaping by abrasion. It is also, by any reasonable measure, extremely difficult to work. For the sphere makers of the Diquís Delta, it was apparently the preferred material, and they sought it out over considerable distances. The nearest outcrops of suitable rock are estimated to lie somewhere between 30 and 90 kilometers from the delta sites where the spheres were eventually placed. The variation in that estimate reflects genuine uncertainty about which specific quarry sites were used, since the quarries themselves have not been definitively identified and documented in all cases. Some researchers have pointed to river cobbles as a possible starting point for smaller spheres, since rivers draining the Talamanca range would have transported large rounded boulders of gabbro into the lowland valleys over time. Using a river cobble as a rough preform would reduce the initial shaping labor significantly. For the very largest spheres, however, river cobbles of sufficient size are unlikely. Those would have required deliberate quarrying from bedrock exposures in the uplands. How the stone was moved remains one of the genuinely open questions in the study of these objects. The most commonly proposed method involves a combination of log rollers, which are round wooden poles placed under the stone to allow it to roll forward as the poles are moved from the back to the front, along with ramps, ropes woven from plant fibers, and large organized teams of workers. None of these technologies would have been exotic to the people of this region. Log rollers have been proposed as a transport mechanism for heavy stones in many cultures around the world, and plant fiber ropes of remarkable strength can be made from materials available in tropical forests. The rivers themselves may have served as transport corridors, with rafts or floating platforms used to move stones downstream from the mountains toward the delta plain. Each of these methods is plausible. None has been confirmed by direct archaeological evidence in this specific case. No ancient rope has been found still attached to a sphere. No log roller has been preserved in association with a transport route. The absence of such evidence is not surprising given the climate, since organic materials decay quickly in the wet tropics, but it does mean that the transport story remains, for now, an educated reconstruction rather than a documented fact. What is clear is that the effort was enormous and was undertaken repeatedly. More than 300 spheres have been documented, and the investment of labor they represent, from quarrying through transport through shaping through final placement, is staggering when considered in aggregate. This was not a casual or occasional activity. It was a sustained cultural practice that persisted across many generations. Let that image of moving stone through dense forest and along swollen rivers carry you gently into the next part of our story, where we look more closely at the craft of shaping. Part 4. The Art of Making Round. Imagine holding a cobble of dark stone in both hands. It is already roughly rounded by the river, smoothed somewhat by decades or centuries of tumbling against other stones in fast-moving water. But it is not a sphere. It is lumpy, asymmetrical, heavier on one side than the other. To turn it into something geometrically precise would take a very long time, and a very particular kind of attention. The craftspeople of the Diquís Delta appear to have worked through a sequence of stages, each refining the form a little further. The first stage, called pecking, involved striking the surface of the stone repeatedly with a harder, pointed stone. Each blow removed a tiny flake or a small amount of powdered material from the high points of the surface. Working systematically across the whole form, moving in patterns that kept the emerging shape as balanced as possible, a skilled worker could gradually bring a rough block towards something recognizable as a sphere. This stage is heavy work, requiring strength and endurance, and the stone's hardness means progress is slow. Once the basic spherical form was established, the work shifted to grinding. A flat or slightly curved grinding stone, possibly used with water and sand as an abrasive, will be worked across the surface in overlapping strokes. The grinding stone wears down the remaining ridges and peaks, smoothing the surface and refining the curvature. This stage requires a different kind of attention than pecking. Finer, more patient, more sensitive to the feel of the surface under the tool. The worker would be constantly checking, by eye and by hand, whether one area is sitting higher than it should, whether the curve flows evenly from one side to the other. The final stage, which may have been applied to the most precisely finished spheres, involved fine abrasion with very fine sand, possibly mixed with water. This would have brought the surface to something approaching polish and corrected the last small irregularities. Some of the spheres show surface textures consistent with this kind of fine finishing work. Modern analysis using three-dimensional laser scanning has given researchers a remarkable view of just how precise the finished products are. A laser scanner can map the full surface of an object to within fractions of a millimeter, producing a detailed mathematical model of its form. When researchers applied this technology to several of the Costa Rican spheres, they found that the deviations from perfect sphericity across the full surface of many specimens were extremely small, in some cases less than 0.5% of the sphere's diameter. For a sphere 2 meters across, 0.5% is about 1 centimeter. That is the margin of error across the entire surface, achieved by hand, in hard volcanic rock, with stone tools. This level of precision places the sphere makers in a remarkable category. It suggests not just skill but a systematic method, one that could reliably produce consistent results. Several hypotheses have been offered for how this consistency was achieved without modern measuring instruments. One involves the use of a simple geometric tool, a cord of fixed length attached to a central point, essentially a three-dimensional compass. By rotating such a cord around a central axis and comparing the stone's surface to the arc the cord describes, a craftsperson could identify high and low points with considerable accuracy. The simplicity of this method is part of its appeal. It requires nothing more than a piece of rope and a reference point. Another hypothesis involves the use of a flat surface and rotation. If a roughly spherical stone is placed on a flat, hard surface covered with abrasive sand and rotated in multiple directions, the natural mechanics of the rotation will cause the high points to contact the surface more frequently and wear down faster, gradually driving the form toward true sphericity. For smaller spheres, this method is physically practical. For the very largest, the weight makes rotation difficult, and another approach would have been needed. Whichever methods were used, the precision achieved speaks to a culture that valued geometric accuracy highly and had developed the technical knowledge to reliably produce it. This is worth sitting with quietly for a moment. Geometry is sometimes presented as a product of literate, institutionalized civilizations, the kind of knowledge that requires schools and written texts and formal transmission. But geometry in its most fundamental sense, the understanding of form and symmetry and spatial relationship, does not require writing. It requires observation, practice, and the careful passing of knowledge from one generation of hands to the next. The craftspeople of the Diquís Delta were geometers. They worked in a medium that resisted them at every stroke, and they produced objects whose accuracy we can measure today with instruments they never had and still find impressive. Rest with that thought for a moment, and then we will move outward from the stone itself to the landscape in which it was placed, and the patterns that landscape contains. Part 5. Patterns in the Earth, Echoes in the Sky. The spheres were never meant to stand alone. Or at least, the evidence strongly suggests they were not. At the sites where careful archaeological work has been done before disturbance occurred, the spheres were found arranged in specific spatial relationships with each other and with the structures around them. These arrangements were not random. They followed patterns that researchers have spent decades trying to understand. At several sites in the Diquís Delta, groups of spheres were aligned in straight lines. These lines ran across the ground in front of what appear to have been important buildings, probably chiefly residences or ceremonial structures. In some cases, the lines contained 2 or 3 spheres. In others, longer alignments of 4 or more spheres have been documented, though many original arrangements were disturbed before they could be properly recorded. The United Fruit Company's land clearing operations in the early to mid-20th century moved many spheres from their original positions, sometimes using them as decorative objects around company buildings or housing complexes. This displacement is one of the great losses in the archaeological record of these objects, since the spatial relationships between the spheres and their surroundings are at least as informative as the spheres themselves. At the site of Batambal, and at the UNESCO-listed site of Finca 6, enough of the original context has been preserved or reconstructed to permit serious spatial analysis. At Finca 6, archaeologists identified a linear arrangement of spheres that, when extended as a sightline, aligns with the position of sunrise at the equinox. The equinox is the moment, occurring twice each year in March and September, when the sun rises precisely due east and sets precisely due west. For agricultural peoples, the equinox is a useful calendrical marker. It divides the year symmetrically and can be used to track the progression of seasons with considerable accuracy simply by observing where on the horizon the sun rises each morning. Whether the alignment at Finca 6 was deliberately intended to mark the equinox, or whether it reflects some other orientation that happens to coincide with the equinox direction, is a matter of ongoing discussion. The alignment is real. Its intentionality is probable but not certain. What can be said is that the people of this region would have had strong practical reasons to track the sun's movement along the horizon, and that using large, permanent stone objects as horizon markers would have been an effective way to do so. Beyond linear arrangements, researchers have also documented groupings of spheres in triangular or other geometric configurations. Some of these have been interpreted as reflecting the positions of bright star clusters as seen from this latitude. The Pleiades, a tight cluster of stars visible to the naked eye, were important to many agricultural cultures across the ancient world as a seasonal marker. Their heliacal rising, the morning when they first become visible above the eastern horizon just before dawn after a period of invisibility, was used in numerous cultures to signal the beginning of planting season. Whether the people of the Diquís Delta used the Pleiades in this way is not documented, but the hypothesis is consistent with what is known about agricultural astronomy in the broader ancient Americas. It is important to be clear about the limits of what the spatial evidence can tell us. Many of the sphere arrangements we know about today are incomplete, disturbed, or known only from early accounts that lack the precision needed for rigorous astronomical analysis. The sites that remain intact are precious partly because they are rare. At those intact sites, the spatial relationships are suggestive and worth continued study. But the evidence does not yet support strong conclusions about a systematic astronomical program encoded in the sphere placements. What the spatial evidence does support, clearly, is that placement mattered. The spheres were not simply made and left wherever they happened to be finished. They were moved to specific locations and arranged in specific ways. The arrangement was part of the meaning. The sphere in isolation was one kind of statement. The sphere in relation to other spheres, and to a building, and to the surrounding landscape, was a richer and more complex one. The landscape of the Diquís Delta itself would have shaped how these arrangements were experienced. The delta is flat, which means that sight lines are long and unobstructed. A line of spheres visible from a distance, approached along a path through cleared ground, would have made a strong impression on anyone arriving at a chiefly settlement. The scale of the largest spheres, rising to chest height or above, means they would have dominated the visual field at close range. They are objects that command attention, and their placement in formal arrangements would have amplified that command considerably. There is something almost architectural about the way the spheres occupy space. They do not fill it so much as they define it, marking out zones of importance and giving physical form to social distinctions that might otherwise be invisible. Stand inside the arrangement of spheres and you are in one kind of place. Step outside it and you are in another. The stones do this quietly, without walls or fences, simply by being where they are. Allow that sense of quiet spatial definition to ease you toward the next part of our journey, where we follow the spheres into the deeper human context of burial, gold, and the lives of those who are laid to rest beneath them. Part 6: Gold, Graves, and the Honored Dead. Beneath some of the spheres, and within the burial mounds nearby, archaeologists have found the remains of a world that was far richer and more elaborate than the plain stone surfaces above might suggest. Gold ornaments, jade pendants, intricately painted ceramic vessels, and the bones of individuals buried with evident ceremony have all emerged from the soil of the Diquís Delta. These finds connect the spheres to the full texture of a society that honored its dead with care and communicated status through beautiful, durable objects. Gold working in this part of Central America reached a high level of sophistication. The techniques used included lost wax casting, in which a wax model of the desired object is encased in clay, the wax melted out, and molten gold poured into the resulting mold. The finished objects, often small pendants in the form of birds, crocodilians, frogs, or human figures, show remarkable detail and a confident mastery of the medium. Gold in this cultural context was not simply wealth in an economic sense. It was understood to carry spiritual significance, associated with solar light, with transformation, and with the status of those powerful enough to access it. The presence of gold objects in burial contexts near the spheres reinforces the interpretation that the spheres were connected to elite social spaces. The individuals buried with gold were not ordinary members of society. They were chiefs, or the relatives of chiefs, or specialists of high ritual status. The spheres standing nearby were part of the same language of power and meaning, expressed in a different medium. Ceramic vessels found in these contexts are also informative. The pottery of the Diquís region in the relevant periods shows distinctive painted designs, geometric patterns, and stylized animal forms rendered in red, black, and orange on a cream background. These vessels were functional but also clearly decorative, made with attention to appearance as well as use. They tell us something about the aesthetic sensibility of the people who made them, a sensibility comfortable with precision, symmetry, and the careful rendering of form. That same sensibility, expressed at vastly different scale and in a different medium, is what produced the spheres. What the burials and grave goods cannot tell us, unfortunately, is the specific meaning of the spheres to the people who placed them. We can observe the association. We cannot read the intention behind it with certainty. Whether the spheres were understood as protectors of the dead, as markers of territorial claim, as cosmological symbols, or as something else entirely, remains genuinely open. The silence of a culture without written records is not empty, but it does require careful listening. Carry the quiet weight of those buried lives with you as we move next into the fate of these remarkable objects in the centuries following their making. Part 7: Displacement, Loss, and the Trouble with Treasure Hunters. The spheres survived the collapse of the chiefdoms that made them. They survived the arrival of Spanish colonizers in the 16th century, who were primarily interested in gold and left the stones largely alone. They survived centuries of forest regrowth, during which some sank slowly into the accumulating soil while others remained half visible on the surface. What they did not survive entirely intact was the 20th century, which brought new kinds of disruption far more damaging than simple neglect. The arrival of the United Fruit Company in the Diquís region in the early decades of the 1900s transformed the landscape dramatically. The company cleared vast tracts of forest for banana cultivation, and in doing so encountered spheres throughout the delta. Workers moved them, sometimes with heavy equipment. Some were pushed aside, some used as decorative features in company gardens and around executive housing. At least one was reportedly dynamited by workers who believed, based on a persistent rumor, that gold had been hidden inside. It had not been. The damaged sphere is a melancholy symbol of what was lost through a combination of ignorance and wishful thinking. The rumor of gold inside the spheres spread more widely than it should have, and for a period it drove deliberate looting. Sites were excavated without any archaeological method, the surrounding soil disturbed, and the spatial context permanently destroyed. Even when the sphere itself was left in place, the removal of associated ceramics, bones, or ornaments from the surrounding context erased information that could never be recovered. In archaeology, context is everything. An object removed from its surroundings becomes an artifact. What it loses is the story. Looters also targeted the burial mounds near sphere sites, seeking the gold objects that had by then become known to exist in the region. The damage to the burial record was severe at many sites. Researchers arriving in later decades found sites that had been extensively disturbed, with only fragmentary evidence of what had once been there. The loss is not just scientific. It is cultural. The descendant communities of the people who made the spheres have lost access to part of their own history. Displacement of a less destructive but still significant kind occurred when spheres were moved to private gardens, hotel lobbies, government buildings, and museum courtyards across Costa Rica. Some of these moves were made with genuine admiration for the objects. The desire to display something beautiful and mysterious is understandable. But each sphere moved from its original location loses the spatial relationships that gave it part of its meaning. A sphere in a hotel garden is still a remarkable object. It is no longer, however, part of an arrangement that might tell us something about the people who placed it. The story of displacement is also, in a quieter way, the story of how long it takes for a society to recognize the value of what it has. That recognition did come, eventually, and we will follow it forward next. Part 8: Recognition, Protection, and the UNESCO Inscription. The formal process of recognizing and protecting the sphere sites gained serious momentum in the late 20th century, driven by a combination of Costa Rican national interest, international archaeological attention, and the growing global framework for heritage conservation. Costa Rica had established the Museo Nacional in San Jose as the primary institutional home for archaeological research and collection, and researchers affiliated with that institution played an important role in documenting sphere sites and arguing for their protection. The nomination of the Diquís sphere sites to UNESCO's World Heritage List was a lengthy process, requiring detailed documentation of the site's significance, their condition, the threats they faced, and the management plans in place to protect them. In 2014, the nomination succeeded. 4 archaeological sites in the Diquís Delta were inscribed together under the name Pre-Columbian Chiefdom settlements with stone spheres of the Diquís. The 4 sites are Finca 6, Batambal, El Silencio, and Grijalba 2. Each preserves sphere arrangements in varying degrees of completeness, and together they represent the best surviving examples of the original spatial context in which the spheres were placed. The UNESCO inscription brought international visibility and a measure of additional protection. It also brought obligations. Costa Rica committed to maintaining the sites, managing visitor access, controlling erosion and vegetation, and preventing further looting or disturbance. These commitments are real but also demanding. The sites sit in a humid tropical environment where vegetation grows quickly and erosively, where rainfall is heavy and the soil shifts. Maintaining the integrity of exposed stone surfaces and the surrounding context requires consistent, well-funded effort. Funding for heritage conservation in a small developing nation is never unlimited, and the sphere sites compete for resources with many other needs. Researchers and conservators who work at the sites have noted ongoing concerns about erosion, the encroachment of roots, and the difficulty of monitoring sites that are not always easily accessible. Some spheres that remain in situ, meaning in their original location, are at risk from the same slow processes of weathering and biological growth that have affected stone monuments everywhere. The Museo Nacional maintains a collection of spheres that have been moved to safer environments, where they can be studied and displayed without further deterioration. This is a genuine conservation benefit, though it comes with the familiar trade-off of context loss. The museum also maintains records, photographs, and increasingly detailed digital models of both the collected spheres and the in-situ arrangements, ensuring that the spatial information, where it was captured, is not lost even if the physical sites change over time. Community engagement has become an increasingly important part of the conservation approach. The indigenous communities of the Baruca and Teraba peoples, whose ancestors lived in this region, have a direct cultural interest in how the sphere sites are understood, managed, and presented. Their perspectives enrich the interpretation of the sites in ways that purely academic archaeology cannot always achieve, and their involvement in stewardship brings both practical benefit and a measure of cultural justice to the conservation effort. The inscription on the UNESCO list has not solved all the problems facing the sphere sites, but it has raised their profile and created a framework within which protection efforts can be sustained. The spheres are, for now, more secure than they were a generation ago. That is worth acknowledging quietly before we continue. Part 9. What the spheres are not. Sometimes understanding a mystery is helped as much by setting aside wrong answers as by finding right ones. The stone spheres of Costa Rica have attracted, over the decades, a considerable number of explanations that range from the plausible to the fanciful, and it is worth spending a little time with the fanciful ones, not to mock them, but to understand why they arise and what they reveal about the way human beings respond to the genuinely unexplained. The most persistent alternative explanation is the one that invokes extraterrestrial assistance. The spheres, in this telling, are too precise, too large, and too numerous to have been made by the people of the Diquís Delta using the means available to them. Therefore, the argument goes, they must have been made by, or at least with the help of, beings from elsewhere. This idea has appeared in popular books, documentary films, and countless online discussions. It is not supported by any archaeological evidence whatsoever, and it rests on a premise that is both factually incorrect and, if examined carefully, somewhat condescending. It is factually incorrect because the precision of the spheres, while impressive, is demonstrably achievable with stone tools and patient technique, as experimental archaeology has shown. And it is condescending because it implicitly denies the capacity of an indigenous culture to produce sophisticated work without outside intervention. Experimental archaeologists, researchers who test ancient techniques by actually doing them, have successfully produced stone spheres of considerable size and accuracy using only tools and methods available in pre-Columbian Costa Rica. These experiments confirm that the task is difficult and time-consuming but entirely within human capability. The spheres are a testament to human skill and organization, not to anything beyond it. Another persistent notion holds that the spheres are natural geological formations, produced by some process of concretion or erosion without human involvement. This idea can be set aside fairly quickly. The spheres are made of gabbro, a rock type that does not form in spherical concretions under natural geological conditions. Their material, their size range, their surface finish, and their archaeological context all point unambiguously to deliberate human manufacture. There is no credible geological mechanism that would produce these objects naturally. A third alternative, somewhat more interesting, is the idea that the spheres were cannonballs used in some form of ancient warfare or sport. This is imaginative but not well supported. The largest spheres are far too heavy to be thrown or launched by any human-powered mechanism, and the smallest, while more manageable, show no evidence of impact damage consistent with use as projectiles. Their placement in elite residential and burial contexts argues strongly against a purely utilitarian or recreational function. Setting these alternatives aside leaves us with the archaeological consensus, deliberately made by skilled human craftspeople for purposes connected to elite status, ritual, and possibly astronomical observation. This explanation is less dramatic than some of the alternatives. It is also far more interesting, because it points toward a real human achievement rather than an imagined external one. Let the quiet satisfaction of that settled understanding carry us forward into the ongoing work of research and what new questions are still being asked. Part 10. New Eyes on Old Stone. Archaeological research on the Costa Rican spheres has not stood still. Each decade brings new tools, new methods, and new questions that earlier researchers could not have asked. The picture that is emerging is more detailed and in some ways more surprising than the one available to Samuel Lothrop when he first catalogued the spheres in the 1930s and 40s. Three-dimensional laser scanning, as mentioned earlier, has transformed the precision with which the spheres can be measured and compared. But scanning technology has applications beyond simply measuring sphericity. Detailed surface scans can reveal tool marks, areas of differential weathering, and surface features invisible to the naked eye. By comparing the surface texture of different spheres, researchers can begin to identify whether similar techniques were used across different sites and time periods, or whether distinct workshops or craft traditions produced recognizable differences in their finished work. Geochemical analysis offers another avenue of inquiry. Different outcrops of gabbro have subtly different chemical compositions, reflecting variations in the magma from which they crystallized. By analyzing trace elements in the spheres and comparing them to samples from known geological outcrops in the Talamanca Range and elsewhere, researchers hope to identify the specific quarry sources for individual spheres. This work is ongoing and technically demanding, but it has the potential to map the movement of stone across the landscape with considerable precision, illuminating trade networks, transport routes, and the organizational reach of individual chiefdoms. Excavation at the UNESCO-listed sites continues, conducted carefully and with full documentation. Each excavation season recovers new artifacts, new spatial data, and occasionally new spheres that were not previously known. Ground-penetrating radar, a technology that sends radio waves into the soil and maps the reflections from subsurface features, has been used to identify buried spheres and structural remains without excavation. This allows researchers to understand the extent and layout of sites before committing to the slow and irreversible process of digging. Radiocarbon dating of organic materials found in association with the spheres has helped refine the chronology of sphere production. Charcoal from hearths, wood from structural remains, and bone from burials near sphere sites have all yielded dates that support and gradually sharpen the estimated production period of roughly 600 to 1500 of the Common Era. Future dating work may narrow this window further and reveal whether production was continuous across that period or concentrated in particular episodes. Perhaps the most significant recent development is the growing involvement of indigenous community members in the research process itself. Descendant communities bring oral traditions, ecological knowledge, and interpretive perspectives that complement the material evidence in important ways. Some oral traditions of the Baruka and Teraba peoples contain references to the spheres and to the ancestors who made them, and while oral tradition requires careful interpretation, it represents a form of knowledge that purely material archaeology cannot generate. The conversation between scientific method and indigenous knowledge is not always easy, but where it is conducted with mutual respect, it tends to produce richer understanding than either approach alone. The spheres, in other words, are still being studied. They are still yielding new information. The mystery has not been solved, but it has been substantially illuminated, and the illumination continues. Rest for a moment with the thought that some of the most important questions about these stones are being asked right now, by careful people working in the humid heat of the Delta, and allow that ongoing curiosity to ease us into the human stories still woven around them. Part 11. The Island Spheres and the Reach of a Tradition. Not all of the Costa Rican stone spheres are found in the Diquís Delta. A significant group of them rests on Isla del Cono, a small island lying about 16 kilometers off the Pacific coast of the Osa Peninsula. The island is now a biological reserve, protected for its coral reefs and marine biodiversity, and it receives visitors primarily as a diving and snorkeling destination. But on the island's interior, on a flat terrace above the shoreline, there are stone spheres, sitting quietly among the trees, far from the mountains where their material originated and far from the mainland settlements with which they are associated. The presence of spheres on Isla del Cono raises questions that the delta sites alone do not. Getting a large stone sphere to an island requires crossing open water, which means boats of sufficient size and stability to carry enormous weight. The largest spheres on the island are not quite as massive as the largest mainland examples, which may reflect the practical constraints of water transport. Even so, moving a stone object weighing several tons across 16 kilometers of Pacific Ocean in a dugout canoe or raft, without modern navigation or safety equipment, is a genuinely demanding undertaking. Why the effort was made is not fully understood. The island appears to have had ritual or ceremonial significance to the mainland chiefdoms. Burials have been found there, along with the remains of structures suggesting periodic occupation rather than permanent settlement. It may have been understood as a liminal place, a threshold between the human world and something beyond it, and the placement of spheres there may have been part of marking that significance in the most permanent and impressive way available. The island spheres also extend the geographic reach of the sphere-making tradition and suggest that it was connected to maritime activity of some sophistication. The people of the Diquís region were not isolated. They traded with other cultures to the north and south, exchanging gold objects, jade, and other goods across considerable distances. The ability to navigate the Pacific coast and cross to offshore islands was part of the same broader capability that enabled long-distance trade and cultural exchange. Looking at the spheres on Isla del Cono also prompts reflection on how the tradition may have been understood by those who maintained it. Carrying spheres to an island is not the most efficient use of significant resources if the goal is purely local status display. It suggests that the sphere tradition had meanings that extended beyond any single chiefdom's territorial claims, meanings connected perhaps to shared cosmological understandings, to ancestral obligations, or to the maintenance of relationships with places understood to be spiritually significant. These are speculative thoughts, and they are offered as such. But they point toward the richness of what we do not yet know, and toward the humility that the spheres seem, quietly, to invite. The island sits in the Pacific, its spheres looking out toward open water, and we will carry that image of stone meeting sea as we turn next to what the spheres have meant to modern Costa Rica and its sense of its own identity. Part 12. A nation finds its symbol. Costa Rica is a small country, roughly the size of West Virginia, tucked between Nicaragua to the north and Panama to the south. It has a population of around 5 million people and an international reputation built largely on ecological conservation, political stability, and the abolition of its military in 1948. It is a country that has, over the decades, thought carefully about how it presents itself to the world. And somewhere in that process of national self-definition, the stone spheres became something more than archaeological curiosities. They became symbols. The spheres appear on Costa Rican currency. They are referenced in tourism materials, in school curricula, and in the kind of casual national pride that surfaces when a country wants to point to something ancient and remarkable and say, "This came from here." The Museo Nacional in San Jose displays several spheres in its courtyard, where they greet visitors arriving at one of the country's most prominent cultural institutions. Their image has been reproduced in ceramics, jewelry, and public art across the country. They have, in short, been adopted. This process of national adoption is not unique to Costa Rica. Many countries have ancient monuments or objects that become focal points for contemporary identity, regardless of whether the people who made those objects are direct ancestors of the current population. The spheres were made by cultures that predate the Spanish colonial period by centuries, and the modern Costa Rican population is predominantly the product of post-colonial mixing of indigenous, European, and African ancestry. The connection between modern Costa Ricans and the sphere makers is real but complex, mediated by centuries of disruption, displacement, and cultural transformation. That complexity does not diminish the genuine pride with which Costa Ricans regard the spheres. If anything, it adds a layer of thoughtfulness to the relationship. The spheres represent something that was here before the colonial encounter, something that survived it, something that belongs to the land itself in a way that transcends the particular histories of any single group. In a country still working through its relationship with its indigenous heritage, the spheres offer a point of connection that is ancient enough to feel foundational. The UNESCO inscription in 2014 reinforced this sense of national significance. Being included on the World Heritage List places Costa Rica in the company of countries whose ancient achievements are recognized as part of the shared heritage of humanity. That recognition matters to a small nation navigating its place in a world where cultural prestige is not evenly distributed. The spheres became, in a quiet way, a form of soft power, an argument for the depth and sophistication of what this land has produced. There are tensions in this process of symbolic adoption, and they deserve acknowledgement. Indigenous communities whose ancestors made the spheres sometimes feel that the national narrative flattens the specificity of their heritage, turning a living cultural inheritance into a generic national emblem. The difference between a symbol that belongs to everyone and a symbol that has been taken from someone is not always clearly marked, and navigating it requires ongoing conversation rather than settled conclusion. The spheres, as always, sit quietly in the middle of these human negotiations, neither affirming nor denying any particular claim. They have outlasted every argument made about them so far, and will likely outlast the ones being made now. Allow that thought to settle as we move into the ways the spheres have traveled beyond Costa Rica into the wider world's imagination. Part 13. Into the world's imagination. The stone spheres of Costa Rica have a cultural reach that extends well beyond the borders of the country that contains them. They have appeared in novels, films, documentary series, and the sprawling landscape of internet curiosity that constitutes much of how people now encounter unusual historical objects. This broader cultural presence is worth examining, because the way a mystery is told shapes what people believe about it, sometimes more powerfully than the evidence does. The most famous fictional appearance of the spheres is probably in the 1984 film Raiders of the Lost Ark, in which Indiana Jones famously flees a large rolling boulder in a jungle temple. The filmmakers have cited the Costa Rican spheres as one inspiration for that sequence, though the boulder in the film is considerably larger and considerably more aggressive than any actual sphere in the Diquís Delta. The film's version lodged itself in popular imagination and almost certainly increased general awareness that such spheres exist, even if the awareness came packaged with a great deal of cinematic embellishment. Documentary films have treated the spheres with varying degrees of seriousness. Some productions have approached them with genuine archaeological care, interviewing researchers, visiting sites, and presenting the evidence honestly. Others have leaned toward the sensational, emphasizing the mystery at the expense of the substantial body of knowledge that exists, or giving undue weight to the extraterrestrial hypotheses that mainstream archaeology has firmly set aside. The most responsible documentaries tend to be the least dramatic, which perhaps explains why they are not always the most widely watched. The internet has created a new kind of cultural life for the spheres. Images of the stones circulate widely, often accompanied by captions that overstate the mystery or repeat debunked claims. The spheres appear regularly on lists of the world's great unexplained mysteries, grouped alongside objects and sites whose genuine unknowns are quite different in character. This kind of aggregation flattens the specific, well-documented reality of the spheres into a generic category of strangeness, which does the objects a mild disservice even when it is well-intentioned. What the spheres genuinely offer to the wider imagination is more interesting than the sensational version. They are an invitation to think carefully about what human beings can achieve through sustained collective effort, about the intelligence embedded in craft traditions that leave no written record, and about the humility appropriate when encountering something made by people whose inner lives we cannot directly access. These are not dramatic themes. They are quiet ones, but they reward attention in a way that the dramatic version does not. The spheres have also attracted serious artistic attention. Sculptors, photographers, and installation artists have engaged with the forms and their context in ways that illuminate different aspects of their presence. A perfectly smooth sphere in a jungle clearing is an inherently powerful image, and artists have responded to that power across different media and traditions. This artistic engagement is part of how objects move through culture and accumulate meaning over time, and it adds to rather than detracts from the archaeological understanding. Let the image of those spheres moving through human imagination, from jungle clearing to cinema screen to museum courtyard, carry us gently into the question of what it means to preserve something whose full meaning we do not yet understand. Part 14. The Ethics of Preservation. Preserving the stone spheres of Costa Rica is, on the surface, a straightforward goal. They are remarkable objects in a remarkable context, and losing them to erosion, looting, or neglect would be a genuine impoverishment. The arguments for preservation are easy to make and hard to dispute. But the practice of preservation involves choices, and those choices carry ethical weight that is worth examining with care. The first choice concerns what to preserve. The spheres themselves are the obvious answer, but the spheres without their spatial context are diminished objects. Preserving the stones means, ideally, preserving the arrangements in which they were placed, the soil surrounding them, the buried features associated with them, and the landscape setting that gives their placement meaning. This is a much larger and more demanding goal than simply protecting the stones themselves, and it requires ongoing active management rather than a one-time intervention. The second choice concerns who decides. Heritage conservation has historically been dominated by professional archaeologists and government institutions, with indigenous communities often consulted late or not at all. The growing recognition that descendant communities have legitimate authority over the interpretation and management of their own cultural heritage has begun to change this. But change is slow, and the power imbalances embedded in existing institutions do not dissolve quickly. In Costa Rica, the involvement of Baruca and Teraba community members in sphere site management is increasing, and this is a genuinely positive development. It is also an incomplete one. The question of access adds another layer. The UNESCO-listed sites are managed partly through controlled visitor access, which protects the sites from the wear and inadvertent damage that large numbers of visitors can cause. But limiting access also limits the sphere site's ability to generate the local economic activity and community engagement that can make conservation self-sustaining. Finding the right balance between protection and access is an ongoing negotiation, and reasonable people can disagree about where the line should be drawn. There is also the question of spheres already removed from their original context. Dozens of spheres sit in museum collections, hotel gardens, private properties, and public spaces across Costa Rica and beyond. Some have been in their current locations for decades, and the communities around them have developed their own relationships with these displaced objects. The case for returning them to their original locations is archaeologically compelling where those locations are known and intact. The practical and social complications of actually doing so are considerable. No simple answer presents itself. What all of these questions share is a common thread: the recognition that preservation is not a neutral act. It involves choices about what matters, who decides, and whose interests are served. Making those choices well requires transparency, inclusion, and a willingness to hold competing values in tension without forcing a premature resolution. The spheres have been sitting in the earth for over 1,000 years. They can afford to wait while the people who care for them work through these questions carefully. The slow patience of the stones themselves seems, in this light, like a kind of model for the conversation still needed around them. Part 15: Erosion, Climate, and the Slow Threat. The threats facing the stone spheres are not all human in origin. The natural environment of the Diquís Delta, which created the conditions for the sphere-making culture to flourish, also works steadily against the preservation of what that culture left behind. Heat, humidity, rainfall, and biological growth are patient adversaries, and they do not require malicious intent to cause significant damage over time. Basalt and gabbro are durable stones, but no stone is immune to weathering. In the tropics, where temperatures are consistently warm and rainfall is heavy, the chemical processes that break down rock surfaces operate faster than they do in cooler or drier climates. Water infiltrates microscopic cracks, carrying dissolved minerals and acids derived from decaying vegetation. Over years and decades, this process softens the surface layer of the stone, making it more vulnerable to physical erosion and biological colonization. Lichens and mosses establish themselves on the surface, their root-like structures penetrating tiny irregularities and gradually widening them. The same surface that once felt smooth and cool to the touch becomes roughened and pitted as the centuries accumulate. For the spheres still sitting in situ at the UNESCO sites, this process is a genuine concern. The inscribed status of the sites brings some resources for monitoring and intervention, but the scale of the challenge is considerable. Conservators can remove biological growth from sphere surfaces using careful chemical and mechanical treatments, but the underlying weathering continues, and the treatments must be repeated. There is no permanent solution, only ongoing maintenance. Climate change adds another dimension to this challenge. The Diquís region already receives substantial rainfall, and projections for the coming decades suggest that rainfall patterns in Central America may become more variable, with more intense precipitation events interspersed with drier periods. More intense rainfall means more erosion of the soil surrounding the spheres, potentially destabilizing them or exposing buried features prematurely. Stronger and more frequent storm events could physically move smaller spheres or damage larger ones. The uncertainty in these projections makes planning difficult, but the direction of travel is clear enough to warrant concern. The buried spheres and associated features present a particular challenge. Ground-penetrating radar surveys have identified subsurface features at several sites that have not yet been excavated. In an ideal world, these features would be left undisturbed until the methods available for their study have improved further. But if erosion or other disturbance is actively threatening a buried feature, waiting may mean losing it entirely. Conservators and archaeologists must make judgment calls about when intervention is more protective than restraint, and those calls are not always easy. Vegetation management at the open sites is another ongoing task. The tropical forest reasserts itself quickly on any ground that is not actively maintained. Roots penetrate beneath sphere surfaces, creating pressure that can crack stone or shift position over time. Clearing vegetation too aggressively, however, exposes the soil to direct rainfall and increases erosion. The balance point requires constant attention and adjustment. These are unglamorous challenges, far from the romance of discovery and mystery, but they are the ones that will determine whether the spheres and their context survive into the future in a form that continues to yield knowledge. The people doing this work, monitoring, treating, clearing, measuring, documenting, are as essential to the story of the spheres as the archaeologists who first brought them to wider attention. Rest with that quiet appreciation for patient maintenance as we move toward the living communities whose relationship with the spheres is the most immediate of all. Part 16. The Living Communities. Behind every ancient site there are living people, and the stone spheres of Costa Rica are no exception. The indigenous communities of southwestern Costa Rica, including the Baruca, the Teraba, and smaller groups in the surrounding region, maintain cultural connections to the landscape of the Diquís Delta that predate the sphere sites themselves and continue into the present. Their relationship with the spheres is not that of outside observers looking in at an ancient mystery. It is something closer and more complicated than that. The Baruca people, who number several thousand and live primarily in villages in the mountains above the delta, are among the most culturally active indigenous communities in Costa Rica. They are known particularly for their carved and painted balsa wood masks, used in an annual festival called the Juego de los Diablitos, the Game of the Little Devils, which dramatizes in symbolic form the historical struggle between indigenous people and Spanish colonizers. The Baruca have maintained their language, their craft traditions, and their ceremonial life through centuries of pressure and disruption. They are a community with a demonstrated capacity for cultural resilience. The Teraba, also called the Broran, are a smaller community living in the valley of the Rio Teraba, the river that runs through the Diquís Delta. Their traditional territory overlaps directly with the sphere sites, and they have a particularly immediate relationship with the landscape in which the spheres sit. The Teraba community has faced significant pressures on its land and cultural continuity, including the flooding of parts of its traditional territory by a hydroelectric project that generated considerable controversy in the years around its construction. For both communities, the spheres are not simply archaeological objects. They are part of a landscape that has meaning, a landscape associated with ancestors, with stories, and with a sense of place that no UNESCO inscription creates or takes away. Oral traditions in the region contain references to the spheres and to the powerful beings or ancestors understood to have been associated with them. These traditions are not identical to archaeological interpretations and do not need to be. They represent a different kind of knowledge about the same objects, and they deserve to be heard on their own terms. The involvement of these communities in the management of the UNESCO sites has grown in recent years, and the direction of that growth is positive. Community members have participated in site monitoring, in the development of interpretive materials for visitors, and in conversations about how the sphere sites are presented to the outside world. These conversations are not always easy. There are genuine differences of perspective between community members, government agencies, and academic researchers about what the spheres mean, who speaks for them, and what their future should look like. Working through those differences takes time and goodwill on all sides. What the living communities bring to the sphere sites that no outside institution can provide is continuity of presence. Archaeologists visit. Conservators treat and leave. Government officials administer from a distance. The communities of the Diquís region are there, in the landscape, season after season, their lives shaped by the same rivers and rains that shape the lives of the sphere makers. That continuity is itself a form of knowledge, and a form of stewardship that deserves recognition alongside the more formally credentialed kinds. The spheres belong, in some meaningful sense, to the people who live closest to them. Carry that thought gently as we move toward the final arc of our story. Part 17. Silence as Knowledge. There is a particular quality of attention that ancient things invite, and it is different from the attention we bring to things we understand. When we stand before something explained, our minds move quickly to categorize, to file, to move on. When we stand before something genuinely mysterious, if we resist the urge to fill the silence with speculation, something else becomes possible. A kind of receptive stillness. An awareness that the limits of our knowledge are not a failure but a condition of honest encounter. The stone spheres of Costa Rica exist at the edge of what we know. We know a great deal about them. Their material, their approximate age, their cultural context, their spatial arrangements, their association with elite society and ritual practice. We know how they were likely made and have a reasonable sense of the effort that making them required. We know that they mattered deeply to the people who produced them, because people do not invest that kind of labor in things that do not matter. What we do not know is the inner life of that mattering. We do not know what a sphere meant to the chief who commissioned it, or to the craftsperson who spent months shaping it, or to the community that gathered to watch it placed in its final position. We do not know the words that were spoken at that placement, if words were spoken. We do not know the name of a single person who made one of these objects. They lived, they worked, they created something of extraordinary precision and evident meaning, and they left no signature that we can read. This anonymity is the common condition of most human beings who have ever lived. The named individuals of history are a vanishingly small fraction of the total. The vast majority of human experience, creativity, and meaning-making has passed without record, known only through its material traces. The sphere makers are in that majority, and the spheres are their traces. There is something worth sitting with in the idea that the most precise geometric objects made in the ancient Americas were produced by people whose names are entirely unknown to us. The precision survives. The identity does not. What endures is the form, and the form itself, a sphere, the most complete of shapes, containing no beginning and no end, facing all directions equally, is perhaps an appropriate monument to a people known only through what they made. Some researchers have suggested that the sphere form itself may have carried symbolic weight related to completeness, wholeness, or the cosmos understood as a unified whole. This is speculative, as such interpretations must be, but it is a speculation grounded in the observable fact that the sphere is a form with universal resonance. Cultures around the world, independently and at different times, have found the sphere significant. It appears in cosmological models, in sacred architecture, in ritual objects across an enormous range of traditions. That the people of the Diquís Delta chose this form, and pursued it with such precision, suggests that they too found in it something that mattered beyond the purely practical. We cannot know what that something was. And perhaps that is appropriate. Not every question requires an answer. Some questions are better kept open, held lightly, returned to over time without the pressure of resolution. The spheres have been sitting in the earth for centuries without resolving themselves into easy explanation, and they show no signs of doing so now. Their patience in the face of our curiosity is, in its own way, instructive. Let that patient mystery ease you softly now toward the final passages of our journey, where we will gather the threads of what we have found and allow them to rest. Part 18. What remains? We have traveled a considerable distance together through this story, moving from the humid lowlands of the Diquís Delta through questions of craft and cosmology, through the disruptions of the 20th century and the ongoing work of conservation and community. It is worth pausing here, before the final passages, to gather quietly what the journey has yielded. The spheres remain. That is the first and most fundamental thing. Whatever happened to the culture that made them, whatever disruptions colonialism, plantation agriculture, looting, and time brought to bear on the Delta landscape, the spheres endured. Not all of them intact, not all of them in their original positions, not all of them understood or protected as they deserved. But they are here. More than 300 of them, distributed across the Delta and its offshore island, ranging from modest to monumental, each one carrying in its smoothed surface the accumulated patience of the hands that shaped it. The knowledge surrounding them has grown considerably since Doris Stone first brought them to wider attention in the 1930s. We understand the geological origins of the material, the probable techniques of manufacture, the cultural context of elite chiefdom society, the spatial logic of their placement, and the range of meanings they likely carried. We have radiocarbon dates that anchor them in time, geochemical analyses that trace their material to specific mountain ranges, and laser scans that confirm the precision of their geometry with a rigor that early researchers could only approximate by eye and by hand. And yet the growth of knowledge has not dissolved the mystery. It has, if anything, deepened it by making its contours more precise. We know enough now to understand the scale of what we do not know. The inner life of the sphere-making tradition, its theology if it had one, its stories, its specific social protocols around commissioning and placing and venerating these objects, remains inaccessible. The silence at the center of the mystery is real, and no amount of additional measurement will fill it entirely. This is not a counsel of despair. It is a description of what honest inquiry looks like when it reaches its natural limit. Science and archaeology are extraordinarily powerful tools for recovering the past, but they work on material evidence, and where material evidence is absent or ambiguous, they cannot conjure what was never preserved. The sphere makers lived full human lives, rich with meaning and relationship and experience, and those lives are gone in a way that no technology will reverse. What remains are the stones, and the stones are enough. They are more than enough. They are enough to anchor a genuine sense of wonder. They are enough to sustain ongoing research that continues to refine our understanding. They are enough to provide a living cultural connection for the descendant communities who regard them as part of their inheritance. They are enough to merit the protection that the UNESCO inscription formalizes and that daily conservation work maintains. And they are enough, on a quiet evening like this one, to serve as the focus of a kind of contemplative attention that slows the mind and opens it gently toward the vast, patient dimension of deep time. The spheres do not ask anything of us. They simply are. And in simply being, with such precision and such stillness, they offer something that is increasingly rare in a world of noise and urgency. They offer an encounter with something that will not be hurried, will not be reduced, and will not pretend to be simpler than it is. Allow that encounter to settle around you as we move into the penultimate passage of our journey. Part 19. A walk among the stones. Imagine, one final time, that you are in the Diquís Delta. The light is the soft, diffuse light of a cloudy afternoon in the tropics, the kind that makes everything look slightly dreamlike, the greens deeper, the shadows softer. The air smells of wet earth and vegetation and the faint mineral coolness that comes from stone that has been sitting in moist soil for a very long time. You are walking along a path through grass kept short by careful maintenance, and ahead of you, sitting on the earth with the uncomplicated authority of things that have always been there, are the spheres. You approach the nearest one slowly. It is perhaps 1.5 meters across, dark grey. Its surface weathered enough to show the texture of the stone but still carrying a residual smoothness that speaks of the work that went into it. You stop a few feet away and simply look. The sphere does not have a front or a back. It faces every direction equally. There is no angle from which it is more or less itself. This is one of the things that makes a sphere unlike almost any other form. It has no preferred orientation, no hierarchy of surfaces, no part that is more important than any other part. It is complete from every vantage point. You walk around it slowly. The light catches its surface differently as you move, revealing slight variations in color and texture. Darker patches where moisture has settled, lighter areas where the stone is drier. At certain angles the surface seems almost to glow faintly, the minerals in the gabbro catching and scattering the diffuse afternoon light. It is a beautiful object. Not beautiful in a decorative or ornamental way, but beautiful in the way that precise, purposeful things often are, the beauty of something that is exactly what it is and nothing else. Behind this sphere, visible through the grass, are two others, larger, sitting in a line that extends toward the tree line at the edge of the clearing. You walk toward them. The largest of the two is taller than your waist, and standing close to it you become aware of its mass in a physical way, the sense that this object displaces a significant portion of the world simply by occupying its space. It does not lean or tilt. It sits perfectly settled, as if the earth beneath it has adjusted itself over centuries to receive it comfortably. Perhaps it has. You place your hand against the surface. It is cool, noticeably cooler than the air, holding the temperature of the deep soil from which it rises. The surface under your palm is not quite smooth in the way that polished glass is smooth, but it is smoother than any natural stone you have handled, smoother than river rocks or beach pebbles, smoother in a way that could only have come from sustained, intentional human effort. You can feel the slight grain of the mineral crystals in the gabbro, the microscopic texture of a very old surface that has been touched by rain and air for over 1,000 years. You stand there for a moment, hand against the stone, and the sounds of the delta fill the space around you. Insects in the canopy, a distant bird, the soft movement of wind through grass, the occasional drip of water from a leaf somewhere behind you. The sphere is silent, as it has always been. It holds no vibration, offers no warmth, gives nothing back. And yet the contact feels like something. Like the briefest possible overlap between a human life measured in decades and a made thing measured in centuries. Like a conversation conducted entirely in texture and temperature and the quiet pressure of a palm against a curve. You take your hand away. The sphere is exactly as it was. You walk back along the path as the light begins to shift toward evening, and the spheres recede behind you into the soft green distance of the delta, patient and still, as they have always been and will be for a long time yet. Let that imagined walk settle into you now, like breath, like the slow cool of stone, as we come to the final resting place of our story. Part 20. The gentle permanence of not knowing. We have arrived, quietly, at the end of our journey through the mystery of the Costa Rican stone spheres. What began in the humid green of the Diquís Delta, with the image of dark stone resting in red soil, has taken us through geology and craft, through chiefdom society and astronomical possibility, through colonial disruption and modern conservation, through the living communities who carry this landscape in their memory and the researchers who carry it in their data. It has been a long and gentle passage, and it ends here, in a place of open, unhurried wondering. The spheres will outlast the questions we have asked about them. They will outlast, in all likelihood, the current generation of researchers, conservators, and community members who tend to them. They will outlast the specific political frameworks within which their protection is currently organized and the particular cultural anxieties that shape how we interpret them. Stone of this density and this size, in a climate that is wet but not freezing, does not disappear quickly. Barring catastrophe, the major spheres of the Diquís Delta will still be sitting in the earth when everyone now alive has been gone for centuries. There is something genuinely comforting in that thought, if you let it settle rather than push it away. The spheres are a reminder that human effort, when applied with sufficient care and intention, can produce things that endure beyond any individual life, beyond any single generation, beyond the particular civilization that generated them. The people who made these objects are gone in every conventional sense. But the objects carry forward something of the intelligence, the patience, and the aesthetic seriousness that produced them. That is not nothing. That is, in fact, a great deal. The mystery at the center of the spheres, the question of what they ultimately meant to the people who made them, is a mystery that we should perhaps learn to hold rather than solve. There is a habit of mind in the modern world that treats unsolved mysteries as problems to be fixed, gaps in the database that will eventually be filled with sufficient research and funding. Sometimes that is the right approach. Mysteries that can be solved should be pursued. But some mysteries are constitutive rather than accidental. They arise not from a gap in the evidence that could theoretically be filled, but from an irreducible distance between one consciousness and another, between a living mind in the present and a living mind in the past. That distance cannot be fully bridged. The inner life of the sphere makers is on the far side of it, and it will stay there, holding that mystery gently, without urgency, without the need to resolve it, is a different kind of knowing. It is the kind of knowing that acknowledges its own limits and finds in those limits not frustration but a certain spaciousness. The sphere makers knew things we do not know. We know things they did not know. Neither body of knowledge is complete. Both are genuine. The conversation between them, conducted across a gulf of centuries through the medium of dark, smooth stone, is one of the quieter and more remarkable conversations that the human species is capable of having with itself. The spheres sit in the delta, and the delta receives the rains, and the rains run off into the rivers, and the rivers move toward the sea, and the sea lies open and patient beyond the island where other spheres look outward toward the horizon. The horizon curves away in every direction, as a sphere does, as the earth does, as the imagination does when it is given enough room to move freely and enough quiet to hear itself think. You have been generous with your attention this evening, following this story through all its passages and pauses. The spheres do not need your attention to endure, but the act of attending to them, carefully and without hurry, is itself a kind of gift, to yourself as much as to the mystery. It is the act of slowing down long enough to let something old and strange and beautiful have its proper weight in your awareness. That is a rare and valuable thing. Let the image of the spheres stay with you as your breathing slows and your thoughts begin to soften at their edges. Dark stone in warm earth. The sound of insects in a canopy far above. The cool curve of something made with extraordinary care by hands that will never be named. The long, unhurried patience of a question that has been sitting in the ground for 1,000 years and is in no particular hurry to be answered. Rest now. The spheres are still there, exactly where they were placed, exactly as round as they were made, holding their silence in the humid dark of the Diquís Delta. They will be there when you wake, and the mystery will be there too, quiet and complete and waiting, as it has always waited, with all the patience of stone.